Thank you very much. And I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you. Just to make you all jealous, here in South Africa, of course, it's summertime and the sun is shining, and our weather this year has been lovely, which helps to offset all the problems we've had with COVID. So give me a moment while I share my screen. It says the host has disabled participant share screening, so screen sharing, so the host will have to enable that, please. It's still just disabled. There we go. Okay. Share, and I'm going to start my presentation. There we go. All right, so we all have the sense that nature is not healthy, and whether that is scientific information or just the experience of ordinary people every day, everything is not right. We also know that there are things that we can do about that. So really the question is, given that we know that this is a problem and that nobody is making, new nature, we only have one planet, the big question is, why is it turning out to be so hard to fix this problem, which we've known about for so many decades? The reason I'm here speaking to you this morning is because of my co-leading of the IPBES Land Degradation and Restoration Assessment, which produced its results in 2018. And the key results are these, is that land degradation is not a distant problem. It's not a problem of some other part of the world. It's a problem in every part of the world to various degrees, and every kind of ecosystem. We only looked at the ecosystems on the land and the freshwater ecosystems that drain them, but it's also true in the oceans. And it really, really matters. About a third of the human population, billions of people, are directly and materially impacted in their lives by land degradation, not their health, their income, the quality of their lives. And this, along with many other of the global problems, disproportionately affects the poor because they are so directly dependent on nature for their livelihoods. We also know that land degradation is one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, especially in the aquatic ecosystems which drain the land. And that is because one of the main reasons that the populations of many species are in decline is because their habitat is no longer suitable for their existence. We further know that there's a very strong interaction between land degradation and climate change in both directions. As we proceed into the 21st century, so the changing climate is in fact itself a big driver of land degradation. Ecosystems find themselves outside of their climatically comfortable zone, and so there's enormous changes which take place, and that is a degradative process. But it works in the other direction as well, is that land degradation is among the significant sources of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. The positive side of this is that if you address land degradation, you also get a big co-benefit for climate mitigation and for climate adaptation. And then finally, we do know how to avoid and fix degradation. This has been work which has been done over decades, and in fact, the toolbox is quite full. We know how to do this. And importantly, in the context of this discussion, policies really matter. So having the right set of policies in place is possibly the single most important thing you can do to enable people on the ground then to go about the specific restoration actions. And so it's very clear that land degradation occupies this kind of central position, not only with respect to climate change and biodiversity loss, as we've just discovered, but also to many of the other priorities which the world has set itself, in the decade up to 2030, the so-called, I need to go back a space, the so-called sustainable development goals. And many of those goals actually rest on having a healthy land. So avoidance of conflict, addressing poverty and ill health, food and water security, obviously, land and ocean quality, obviously, but climate change, and one of the big drivers is sustainable consumption as well. So one of the reasons why we've made poor progress historically in this area is because we've got hung up around definitions. And part of that is because change is not by itself degradation. Often we undertake change for very good reasons, and that doesn't necessarily mean that what we have led to is degradation. And as a result, what one person sees as degradation, other people may see as their preferred state. And just think about this in your own life. You know, we live in cities. We did that deliberately so that we can have, comfortable habitation. We create farmland so that we can eat. We manage our forests so that we can have a supply of timber and fiber from them. Those are not by themselves degradation. But as a result of this, establishing baselines and desired states, what do we actually want? It becomes a multiple objective problem. We have to deal with all kinds of different people's views of what the land should be. And we always have to ask ourselves, degraded from what and restored to what? And so the concept of ecosystem services offers a way forward in this complex landscape. And just to remind you, what we mean by ecosystem services are the benefits that people get from nature. So this kind of degradation definition really helps us to make progress. And that is, it has these elements. The degradation is the persistent loss, not just a variation. It's lost and it stays lost of one or more desired attribute that we're getting out of this ecosystem. And note that it doesn't mean that we have to have lost all of the attributes for there to be degradation, and nor that a change in one attribute necessarily overwhelms all the other attributes as being, more important. That's a discussion that kind of society has to have. So in that top graphic, what we're showing is an ecosystem service or services varying over time, as all ecosystem services do. They vary over time, but there's no overall trend, and that we do not consider to be degraded. You might have drought in one year, but good rainfall in another year. You might have, some disturbance event or whatever. That's not by itself degradation. But in the second graphic, what we're showing is some original state, then a degradation event, which pushes down the delivery of ecosystem services, and then it stays low for some period of time. It may then recover either because we have removed the driver of the degradation, removed the cause of the degradation, and it may spontaneously recover, or else we may actively go in there and try and fix it, plant new propagules, reintroduce species, do whatever we need to do. And then it may recover either to its original state or to some state which isn't quite at its original state, but is self-sustaining over time. And if you follow that kind of definition, then we can measure degradation as being the sum of that area between the level of delivery of ecosystem services and the level that they should be delivered at, that historically they were delivered at. And of course, when we're talking about taking action about degradation, it's the future sum that matters. That which has happened in the past is, important, but it's happened in the past. It's water under the bridge. We need to be looking forward to saying, what future state do we want? And to measure degradation in that way, we really need to measure several things. One is, what is it that we're talking about this degradation? What's the attribute that has been lost here? Secondly, how badly has it been? What's the degree of loss? And how persistent is that? Will it simply go away by itself after a short period of time, or is it for a very long period of time? And part of our problem is that we kind of stuck in an oversimple way of thinking about degradation. A lot of us still kind of think that there was this original natural ecosystem which was wonderful, and then humans came along and they degraded it. Sorry, I need to go back. They degraded it into a degraded version, or else they, replaced it with some other version, and that's a bad thing. And what we need to do is go back to that original state. Well, that's not very helpful, because it just sets us up for a continuous conflict with anything that we want to do, which is of human benefit. And it sets up this fight between, development and conservation, which has been so unproductive over time. In fact, we need to tease apart this idea of degradation between intentional transformation and degradation. So very frequently, you can have an original natural ecosystem which can become degraded. You can damage it, through neglect or through overuse. But often what we've also done is we've transformed that ecosystem into something else that we want. And then that replacement ecosystem can itself be degraded. So now you've, for instance, created a farmland out of a forest, but that farmland might itself become degraded as a farmland. It may not be delivering what you intended it to deliver. And once you've separated out these degradations from the transformations, it means that there are lots of different sorts of rehabilitation or restoration that you might want to do. So if you're just recreating a function, a desired function, that's really a rehabilitation. If you're trying to restore the original composition and the exact state of that ecosystem like it was sometime in the past, that's a full restoration. And that is a much more difficult thing to do. So what we have discovered over the last number of years is that when you prioritize your action, so having agreed that we need to do something about this, there's always a limited amount of resources we have, because we also have to spend money on many other things, on health and education and fighting COVID and whatever. So if you make deliberate choices about where and what you restore, you end up being much more efficient. In other words, you end up being able to achieve more with less than if you didn't do that. And the reason for that really is that the cost to rehabilitate rises as an ever steepening curve depending on the degree of degradation. So whereas an ecosystem is undegraded, there's a certain cost of avoiding degradation. It's the cost of education, it's the cost of monitoring, it's the cost of a certain amount of enforcement and policing and regulation and whatnot goes on. But the moment the land actually starts losing its inherent ability to look after itself, then the amount of resources you have to pour into it to get it fixed, just rises steeper and steeper. And at some point, you cross some threshold where restoration, full restoration, effectively becomes impossible. You just can't ever recreate it the way it was. And so, as we can also create a curve of benefits that arrive from ecosystems. So if we assume that our benefit flow in the undegraded ecosystem is quite high, as your degradation proceeds, so it steeply and acceleratingly goes down. And at some point, actually at some level of degradation, it no longer sends benefits at all. It's actually sending disbenefits, actual hazards or damages to other things that we are interested in. And so when we put that cost curve and that benefit curve together, we can do a kind of a cost benefit analysis of where you should be doing restoration actions. So what we know is it's extremely worthwhile to invest in the avoidance of further degradation. In other words, stop degradation before it starts. Invest in healthy ecosystems, make sure that they don't get degraded. That has a cost benefit which is of many times higher. The next thing you need to do is to look at things which are just starting to degrade. So they haven't lost their inherent capabilities yet. There's still a seed store there. You can still quite easily bring them back to where they want to, where they need to be. And only then do you move on to things which are moderate degradation. Now, your investment in restoration here still actually delivers a cost positive outcome, typically in the region of 3 to 5 times what your initial investment is, if you count all the benefit streams that result. And only once you've done all that, should you be going on to severe degradation? That may still be cost beneficial, but not until you've done all those other things before then. There may be certain circumstances where you do want to go after the most severely degraded things. If, for instance, they are centers of contagion, of damage in other parts of the ecosystem, then you might need to kind of solve it at source. Or if they are the last remaining habitat for a critical, organism, or they are imposing a real risk to infrastructure or to human life. But that would typically be the sequence that you would follow. And that brings me on to the post-2020 regime in the Convention on Biological Diversity, because now we've reached 2020, we were supposed to have achieved the Aichi targets. All the evidence is that we failed quite dismally on almost all of them. And so now, what are we going to do in the next decade? And there is a leaning towards, instead of having 20 targets, have something much simpler, like no net biodiversity loss. And this leads on the idea, which is in the Convention on combating desertification, and is also in the Sustainable Development Goals, of land degradation neutrality. In other words, land degradation neutrality says it's inevitable that we alter the land sometimes for doing things which are agreed to be in the common good. But when we do that and there's no alternative, we need to balance that by restoring land somewhere else which is equivalent. And it sounds like a reasonable way forward. So of course, this is essentially an offset question. And offsets have been well explored in the area of climate change. And for climate change, it makes a lot of sense because a ton of carbon dioxide in one part of the world is really the same as a ton of carbon dioxide in another part of the world. But when you start applying it to biodiversity and to land degradation, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the advantages are you can easily show that offset approaches are really economically efficient because you're not wasting your money in places where you're getting very little benefit. It also allows us a way forward. We can do away with this inevitable conflict between development and conservation, and the resources that become available help us to fund protection schemes. The problems associated with it is that in the area of land degradation, and especially in the area of biodiversity, the idea of equivalence, what is equivalent to what, becomes very, very difficult. If I lose 1 hectare of this kind of forest there, can I replace it with that kind of forest in a different place? How do you do that sum? That becomes a very difficult negotiation. And if you base it on composition, because no part of the world is exactly the same as any other part of the world. Everyone is to somewhat extent discrete and unique. It becomes impossible. If you base that discussion, the land